This is a short video on what you can usually expect to find when you buy a used rapidograph or vintage Koh-I-Noor. These were actually considered more fountain pens, but they are technical pens because of the type of nib they have. And I have just purchased these two pens fairly inexpensively, and they were both used and they were both sold as may need cleaning. So here is what you may find. There's a little bit of ink around the nib on this one, but really you'll be able to tell when you see that. This is all dried, probably Koh-I-Noor black ink, universal or ultra draw ink. That's generally the ink that is recommended for these pens. And this is coming apart very easily, but it's very dirty. And as I take this apart, you can see that down here where the weight would be, there's a lot of dried ink, and so this has to go into an ultrasonic cleaner. This is so dry in there, it's in chunks. So that's what you can expect when you buy a used pen. Now with the vintage pens, this is a modern rapidograph. With the vintage pens, it's much more difficult to tell because they fill differently, they work differently. It obviously comes apart. Sometimes these get stuck. This is the cap that covers the filling mechanism. Let me just turn it this way so you can see that better. But the interior of the pen isn't really accessible. So the first thing to do is see if the nib will come off by itself. 9 times out of 10, they won't. And if I have one right here, there is a special gold color nib key, which, let me just grab one, that, as I was saying, there are special gold nib keys that look like this that are correct for the vintage pens, and they fit on like that. And this is very sticky. You can feel that the nib is turning, but it's very sticky. So that's an indication that you have old ink on the nib section, and it will need to be cleaned. These are still worth it. I forget what I paid for these. It might have been about $6 or $7 a piece, but it's well worth that for the type of pen they are and the fact that they can be cleaned up. But you can see there is gunky ink all along here, and that needs to all come off of there. Now, you can't see in the barrel, and when you fill these pens, you turn the bottom knob here to the left or to the right to either fill it or to push the air out in order to fill it. So this also feels a little sticky. Now, even though there wouldn't be ink down here, the plunger inside is obviously having a little bit of problem. So if you don't have an ultrasonic cleaner, what you can do for the barrel and the cap, if it's dirty, is you can soak them in plain water overnight, and it should loosen up on the vintage pen. You could also do that with this and then use a pipe cleaner to scrub out the reservoir on the modern pen. The modern nibs take a black nib key, and you'll see there's a little raised edge in the middle circle. That goes toward the bottom on both of the nib keys. Now this is also turning, But look at this, what's falling out of it as I do this is old ink. So this is dirty and needs to be cleaned. Now I have a very inexpensive ultrasonic cleaner. Koh-I-Noor used to make really nice ultrasonic cleaners, but I haven't been able to find one for a few years, and they ran about $100. I currently have a jewelry ultrasonic cleaner that runs about $15. It has different cycles that you can set on it for different amounts of time. And that's what I am going to use for each of these. All of the parts that have been taken apart now, and this is as far as they come apart, I put one pen or one set of parts. Look at this. This is off the vintage one. I'll put all the vintage parts in separately from the new parts. I keep all of them separate. If you don't have an ultrasonic cleaner, or just in general, this is the Koh-I-Noor pen cleaner fluid, and it's concentrated. Even if you're going to soak parts in water, it's better to have this so that you can then add a little bit of this to the water and thin out that ink, and this goes a long way. It is concentrated. I think it's about $9 a bottle right now, but it lasts quite a while, and I dilute it in the ultrasonic cleaner. It also comes in smaller containers. This is 2 ounces, so if you only do this once in a while, this might be enough. I buy the 8-ounce bottle. So what I'm going to do is each of these pens will go into the ultrasonic cleaner for one cycle of 180 seconds. And I know that's not going to take that off of there. They're probably going to end up going through at least 3 times on that cycle before I feel they're clean. They're all cleanable, though. And even with this barrel, if you soak it in water, if you have a similar resistance when you turn this, this should loosen up even being soaked in water. Now, the bulb syringe cleaner is a an ink flow starter and a point cleaner. So what I've also done is take a nib like this or the other one and place it about that deep into a container of the ultrasonic cleaner, and then using the bulb syringe on the nib, pull the cleaning fluid through the nib. So you can do that too. You know, I don't usually find this type of ink on them. It's usually so dried that it doesn't come off of there, and then it takes about the same amount of time to clean them either way. But once I put these through the ultrasonic cleaner, they're going to be like brand new. So when you and if I didn't have the ultrasonic cleaner, I would probably put some fluid in here if I didn't have a 2-ounce container, and I would just soak the nib in it. Your fluid will turn black, but it's still the cleaning fluid, and until it gets really gunky looking or thick, it still works. So you can just throw the nib in the cleaner itself and let that soak overnight. So there are a few different ways to clean these pens. It is important to use the gold vintage nib key on the vintage nibs because they're shaped differently. They look very similar. The 2 nib keys look very similar, but the shape on the inside of the inner circle is different. And what will happen if you use this nib key, see, it's difficult to force it down, and if you do force it down, you're actually stripping the plastic a little bit on the sides, and you don't need to do that. They're somewhat hard to find, but if you buy any vintage pens, if you're lucky, at least one nib key will come with one of the pens that you buy. So these are gunky, and these are going into the ultrasonic cleaner for a few cycles. I've put the modern pen parts through the ultrasonic cleaner once, and the nib collar is just about clean. The nib itself is not. The surface ink is gone off of it, but it's still, I can see that there is dried ink on the weight in there. So this will go through again, but it much better than it did look. This is a very small nib size, so it's even more important to get this completely clean. This nib size, which is 6 odd, tends to clog anyway, unless you're using simply black ink. If you use colored inks, these can clog. So, and here's the reservoir, and big chunks of ink came out of the reservoir. So this will, as I said, go through at least 2 more times, and maybe the nib up to 5 times, until I know this nib is almost like brand new. That's when I'll stop putting it through an ultrasonic cleaner. And if you don't have an ultrasonic cleaner, you would continue to soak it in the cleaning fluid or in water, and use a bulb syringe cleaner to pull the fluid or the water through the nib. This is after 2 cleanings on the modern nib. And you can see, you're supposed to see all silver through there. Some of this is liquid, and it's just black because the fluid I'm cleaning it in is black. But, and that's partly why I always have rags or handkerchiefs or something. You can wick a little bit of that fluid out of there if you can't quite tell how clean your nib is yet. Just by doing that, you can see that the fluid starts to come out. The nib itself doesn't seem to have too much dried ink left on it, except at the bottom rim. But even that's important, because you don't want any dried ink on this at all, on any nib, but especially on a nib with a very small size. You may be able to hear the ultrasonic cleaner going in the background. I wanted to say the vintage nibs are actually a little bit easier to clean. Well, this one in particular is a size 3. So the larger the nib is, the easier it will be to clean. This, I don't know how old the ink is that's been in here. It's at the tacky stage, and still needs to be clean. This, you know, as I said, I'll probably throw the whole barrel in there. I'm not going to throw the cap in. I'm not going to throw the knob cap in. But the barrel and the nib will go in there. And because this is a size 3, all of this should come off very easily. And because I'm throwing the barrel in, that resistance should loosen up very easily, and I should be able to quickly fill this pen and be able to use it. It's the smaller nib sizes that may take extra cleaning when you're doing this. Okay, this is after 3 cycles on the modern nib, and I'm using a pipe cleaner to clean out the ink reservoir, but you can see that it has come completely clean, so that's fine, and that's after 3 cycles. The nib, on the other hand, if I can get this to be in focus a little bit, still has some black at the bottom after 3. But what I'm going to do, sometimes when you're soaking these or doing this with water, you can't get it perfectly clean. So what I'm going to do is put it back together and see if I can get some ink to come through it. And you will see what problems you might run into with a small nib and getting ink to come through. So I've screwed the nib back into the collar, and that went in very easily. I placed the reservoir back on, put the reservoir collar back on, And when I dry my hands, I'll put that back in the barrel. Of course, it would help to put the ink in. There are a couple of types of ink here. This is Koh-I-Noor Universal Green. This is a vintage, and the label is coming off. This is vintage Rotring Artist Color. These were trial sizes. This ink is no longer made. You can sometimes find vintage bottles of it. This was the most fluid, non-clogging ink I had ever seen. Rotring Artist Color. Transparent colors, not the opaque. Wonderful ink, no longer made. So the ink I use today is FW Acrylic Artist Ink by Dale Rowney. What I'm going to do is fill the ink reservoir about half full. I happen to need this particular color. These are normal green. I'm working on a plant picture, and these two greens are too dark. So I would need this color anyway, and I'm going to fill the reservoir about, well, here's the fill line right there, and I'm going to fill it about a quarter of an inch below that, and then I'm going to put distilled water into the fill line. There is my reservoir with, as you can see, there's the fill line, and now I'm going to add the distilled water. I had to do that over by the sink because I had to use another eyedropper. That bottle's not full anymore, and sometimes the eyedroppers don't reach all the way to the bottom. Even though that looks dirty, that is distilled water. I put it all back together. Most of the time with this nib size, I actually dilute any pigmented ink about half and half. But this is a test for this pen. It still had some black ink left on the weight part of the nib. Now I'm going to use this as a point starter. I'm putting the bulb syringe right on the nib, and it's not on there correctly. When it does go on there correctly, now I will leave it like that until this pops out. And what it is doing is drawing the ink up out of the reservoir. And with a pen that's been used and dirty and cleaned by you, this may take a while. You may have to do this several times. If it happens the first time that you get green ink coming out of the nib, then everything's wonderful. But this went through 3 times in the ultrasonic cleaner, when I had said personally I'd probably do it 5. But if I had been soaking this in cleaner, this might be where I would be with this nib, and I would need to work on my drawing, so I'd need to get the ink going. So we'll see how long this takes. Sometimes when the ink starts to flow, you'll see overflow up here. That's how these get dirty. But the suction is not popping out very quickly, so this is having a little bit of a difficult time to pull this out. It's typical. This is typical, and you may have to do this a few times to get the ink flowing correctly, especially with any pigmented ink. And I only diluted this, well, not as much as I normally would have, which would have been half and half. Okay, that did not pop out very quickly, and I tend to have very little patience with doing something else and waiting for this to happen. So if you're at this point and you can't get the ink to flow up out of the nib, what I will then do most of the time is put the barrel on, and again, using the ultrasonic cleaner, stand the pen up with the tip down in the ultrasonic cleaner. And what that will do is the ultrasonic action goes up into the nib, jiggles everything around, and it should start an ink flow. It won't always start an ink flow, especially on a small pen size, but it should. And this just takes patience, and once you have ink flowing on the smaller pens, you generally don't have a problem unless you all of a sudden start using a thicker ink or something. So let's go, I'm going to stand this up in the ultrasonic cleaner and see if that helps. In the meantime, the vintage nib has been in the ultrasonic cleaner for 2 cycles, and we'll see what that looks like. Here's the vintage barrel and the vintage nib. Now the nib looks great on the outside, the tip is clean, but there is, again, still dried ink on the weight. And once that, the ink is actually dried on a piece of metal, and it is permanent ink, so it takes a few times to get that off of there. But this is a size 3 nib. I could do the same thing that I'm doing with that one, and I'm running a little bit of a risk here with both of them. If I fill this, now the barrel was clean. Anything that was coming out of the barrel was just clear. So the barrel was clean or empty, or the ink wasn't bad enough to be causing a problem. So this pen may not have been used very often, and the ink residue may only be up in the nib section. The risk I'm running with both of these by leaving that on there is that little chunks of that could now break free as you use the pen and then get pulled up through the nib. In a nib this size, it may not matter. In the smaller pen, it would matter. It might clog the pen permanently. So this is why, as much as that you can get off of there, the better. Now I'm going to fill this with Processed Yellow by FW and Dalla Rowney, because when I work with botanical illustration, and Processed Yellow is usually a color I use quite often, and because I have a full bottle, what I'm going to do is put the nib in here and then insert the nib to about here in the ink. And I don't have the directions in front of me for the vintage pens. I'm pretty sure you turn the knob to the left to force the air out, and then turn the knob to the right to pull the ink in. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. I do have another video on filling these, and if I remember correctly. So right now I've turned this to the left, and then turning it to the right. I'm going to find the directions. And I was right. Directions say turn filling knob counterclockwise until resistance is felt and the plunger is now all the way down. Then turn the knob back clockwise until resistance is felt. Plunger is now all the way up, barrel 3/4 full. Yeah, see, that's opposite. Alright, so turning it counterclockwise, and I am getting some black coming out of there. Turn the filling knob counterclockwise until resistance is felt. Okay, that's where I am. Plunger is now all the way down. Turning it to the right pushes the plunger back up. Okay, so to fill the pen, you would think I would get this and remember it. To fill the pen, you actually want to turn to the left to have the ink draw up through the nib into the pen. Turn it to the right to force the plunger back up, and then turn it to the left. And if you do that 2 or 3 times while it's in a bottle of ink, you will end up drawing up enough ink to fill the reservoir inside. And there is a brand new bottle of ink. And this really is wonderful, wonderful ink. I love this ink. It's very free-flowing. I'm going to wipe off this vintage nib because that was the cleaning fluid that was coming out of the pen, and I don't really want to get that back into my ink and ruin my yellow ink. I guess I could remove the nib, and using a dropper when the plunger is all the way down, I could fill it that way. Let me just do this again. See how that's coming out? And if I do that 2 or 3 times in my bottle of ink, I'm going to ruin my bottle of ink. So what I'm going to do is take it all apart again before I fill it and wash it off with just clear water. I've rinsed it off. I've got the plunger all the way down. So as I turn to the right, I would be pushing the plunger up. I'm sticking it in there, and I'm going to turn it to the left. And I did get some cleaning fluid in there anyway. Now, I'm going to do that once. It says doing it several times on the directions, but I'm going to do it once. And I'm going to use the point starter. I'll clean this off and then use the point starter to get the ink flowing. Okay, I've cleaned it off. Now on the vintage nibs, because they're tulip shaped, you can't just put the bulb syringe on there and leave it there. You have to hold it in place so they don't fit all the way down. Now, filling the pen once, when they recommend several times, didn't put a lot of ink in the barrel. But if I get ink to come up out of the tip with the first couple of times, then I know that the nib is actually clean and working. And you really have to hold this down against the nib to get the suction action. And with the nib this large, I'm getting fluid from it and not yellow ink. So I either have to put more ink in there, which probably is what I have to do, is fill it. A lot of pens, you need to have them at least half or 3/4 full before the ink will come up through the nib correctly. And that fluid you're seeing is actually from the bulb syringe tip and not from the pen. And I'm just getting fluid out of this as I suction the nib. So I don't have enough ink in there. And I don't really want to ruin that bottle of ink of yellow. So I'm going to take a little of it and put it in a separate container, like a film canister. And I'm going to fill the pen that way so that if I ruin any of the ink, I'm not ruining the whole bottle. But I'm unscrewing the nib right now to see if any of the yellow is coming up, and it doesn't look like it. Although I can see yellow in the barrel. So at this point, when you have this kind of a problem or this issue with a large nib size, personally, I start all over again. The whole thing gets taken apart and back through an ultrasonic cleaner or soaked for longer. I then fill the barrel correctly the first time with enough ink and do this all over again with drawing the ink up. It's not always this complicated, and you don't always have to repeat things. But when you buy a pen that you don't know the history of, except that it's clogged with ink, then sometimes you do actually have to do things 2 or 3 times until you're sure that the pen is working the way that it was originally intended to work. So this will all go right back in the ultrasonic cleaner. Standing the modern pen up in the ultrasonic cleaner, I'm not sure yet whether that helped or whether it cleaned it. I've got the bulb syringe back on it. And you may be wondering, it seems like all of this might be inconvenient, and why don't I just buy a brand new pen? A brand new modern pen, the smaller nib sizes, runs about $22 a piece, plus shipping. The vintage pens, well, they go anywhere from $10 and up, depending on the condition of the pen. And these obviously are all going to be used unless you find a new old stock pen. The reason I would buy these used pens is because I use a lot of colors, and the more I have, the better. I have 4 or 5 of this size that I've bought brand new, and the rest I've bought used, and I have maybe 10 of them total. So it depends on whether or not you want to put this kind of an effort into it when you buy a used pen. If you use them yourself, you're going to have to do this with your own pens from time to time if you forget to clean them, if you have too heavily a pigmented ink in a smaller nib size. So this is part of pen and ink. So you can either save money on the pen and clean them yourself, or you can buy them brand new and pay about triple what you can usually get one for used. It's really a personal decision. But I'll keep working on these two until I have them flowing correctly. Now I can tell that there is enough ink in the reservoir at this point of yellow. So I should be getting yellow coming out of this tip, and I'm not. I'm getting a little bit of cleaning fluid, but especially with a large size nib like this, this shouldn't really be happening. So there's probably ink clogged in the nib. And what that means is that I can leave the barrel full now and just keep re-cleaning the nib until I get the nib to work correctly. Yeah, see, there's nothing coming out of there at all. And if I force the plunger up a little bit, I can see I have yellow ink in here around the nib. So it's not the barrel or the reservoir, it's the nib. And this size pen should really start immediately without a problem. So that means there's something clogged in there. and I will be, oh, wait a minute, there is yellow. Do I see yellow? I see blackish yellow. So what I'm going to do is stand this up in the ultrasonic cleaner like that, and that should loosen any clogs in there. Look at this. Look at this. I don't even have to do that. My ink had gotten dirty from the fluid. You can see there's a little bit of a blackish tone to that. Can you see that? That's a dirty yellow coming out of there. So now what I'll be doing is I'll keep scribbling like that until I get clean yellow. But the pen is clear and the reservoir is full, and this particular pen, to get it to this point, took about 15-20 minutes. So for me, that's not bad, a bad time investment for getting a vintage pen for $6 or $7. Now I'm getting not quite a consistent line. So I think even though this is working, I will stand it up in the ultrasonic cleaner one more time until I get a clean yellow coming out of it. So, but this pen is basically done, because now it's just a matter of fine-tuning. The pen itself is working, and now it's fine-tuning the color I'm using, making sure the pen is full, and making a final check that the nib is clear by standing it up one more time in the ultrasonic cleaner. The other pen is going to take more time, but it will be the same process until I get green ink flowing from there correctly. One more note on this pen. I do this all the time. I shake it, and you can hear the weight moving back and forth. That doesn't always mean your nib is going to work or that it's clean, because the weight is down here on this, down in this area of the nib, and if the nib is clogged between there and here, you can shake the weight all you want. It's not going to bring the ink up through the nib. So this one may also come apart again. There was some black residue still on the weight, and I'll keep fiddling with it until I know that the ink is flowing correctly. But when you shake a pen, I think even Koh-I-Noor recommends that if you can hear the weight going, then your ink should be flowing any second. And I found that's not always the case, because it depends on what's in your nib. One note about the ink that I use to test the size 3 vintage pen. I actually put about this much ink in there, and the rest of this is distilled water. And this will now be my test ink for used pens, so that I'm not ruining any ink other than this if I get cleaning fluid in it. So this won't actually end up in my drawings, but it's a vial of test ink that I can use to make sure pens are flowing correctly. One last point that I feel I have to note here. These instructions for filling a pen came with a 6/0 vintage pen, and it says when you turn the knob counterclockwise to the left, you will be lowering the plunger and then filling the reservoir. I am finding with this pen that as I turn to the left, I'm forcing air out. So this pen seems to be opposite of what those directions are saying. I just mention that because I've always followed the directions before and they've been correct, and yet I've done this several times now, and turning this counterclockwise must actually be pushing the plunger up, because I'm getting ink coming out around here, and the ink is now flowing through the pen with yellow because I've worked the pen opposite of those directions. So it's just kind of a note that if those instructions that may come with a vintage pen don't work, try it the opposite way. I've never run into that before. Never run into that before where a pen was filling opposite than the directions. But I'm getting my yellow out of this. Now, could they be different years? Yes. Could Koh-I-Noor have changed the design? Yes. I've just never heard of it before. And maybe this is an odd pen. Even that doesn't make sense. So I'm not sure why that this seems to be filling opposite of what the directions are saying. It's probably something I'm doing, but I can't see what that would be right now.